Thank you so much, Linnea. Next, we have Abhishek Nagaraj. He is an assistant professor at UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. His research focuses on the economics of data, innovation, and science.
Okay, that works. Thank you for that fascinating talk. My dissertation was called The Economics of Maps, and so we have a lot to chat about. And thank you to Grace and all the other organizers for organizing this wonderful event and for including us on the program. Some of what I'll talk about will build on some of the themes that we talked about this morning, especially around data and data infrastructure and the effects that that can have on promoting research. So the title of this work is called How Does Data Access Shape Science? Evidence from the Impact of Census's Research Data Centers on Economics Research. And all the credit for this work really goes to my co-author, Matteo Tranchero, who's a PhD student at the business school here at Haas. If you're a science nerd like me, last summer you might have seen images like this from the James Webb Telescope. And these are nice wallpapers and nice images that many of us might have downloaded, but they also represent data, new data about the universe that are already leading to incredible new discoveries and an outpouring of science in this area. And we might think in the social sciences that really cool for the astronomers and the astrophysicists, but I would argue that our own field has been going through a similar revolution. So think about the release of data sets, what I call universal data, from the possibility that these kinds of data are available for research, including from the RS, especially data from statistical agencies in Scandinavia, and looking at the research record around how many papers in economics are using this kind of administrative data, we see just a dramatic explosion in the application and use of these kinds of data for research. So motivated by kind of this broad phenomenon, in this project, we're asking, how does access to large-scale admin data shape the quantity, quality, and the direction of scientific research? And in particular, we're going to focus on two important dimensions. First, how does these effects differ for empirical and theoretical researchers? So does one crowd out the other, or are they too complementary? And second, how do we measure the effects of these data if there are spillovers to non-adopters? Are there spillovers? And if so, through what channels do they operate? In order to answer this question, we're going to focus on perhaps the most important source of admin data in the US, which are the set of data made available to the US Census. So these data are distributed to what I call RDCs, or research data centers, that are a network of data access centers providing access to confidential admin data. These data centers have gradually expanded over time since 1994 to over 30 different centers. And the reason that is important is you need physical access. In order to get access to the data, you need to be physically present in one of these RDCs in order to work with them. And so combined with bibliographic data on what's happening on the scientific space, you can try to understand how the founding of an RDC affects the research infrastructure on the other side, which is precisely what we do. Before I jump into the details of the study itself, let me just preview what we find. First, even though one could have flown to DC to work with this data or collaborate with someone at Census, local access really matters. So when an RDC opens up in your university or in your town, the use of Census data, and importantly, citations to papers using this data, grow substantially. And most of these gains are focused amongst empiricists only. So that already starts to give you a clue about the role of this data in shifting the tone of the field from one methodology to another. Second, we find that treated empiricists are about 20% more likely, produce about 20% more publications per year in top academic journals. And a significant portion of this effect is driven through spillovers. So there are certain researchers that directly adopt these data and use those to produce high quality publications, but other researchers are shifting the focus of their research towards new facts that come out from these data that allows them to publish high quality research, as well as adopting more high quality research designs, the kinds that we have talked about in this conference. And so data can have these important knock-on effects on some of these other channels that can improve productivity. This work makes a bunch of different contributions, but I'll just mention 3 different categories. A lot has been written about admin data policy in the US, and about how we need a lot more investment. And surprisingly, most of that conversation has been data-free. So our paper is one of the first to shed some light and bring some data to bear on this question. Second, increasingly, there's been a stream of research studying the economics profession, looking at inequality on different dimensions. And our work is among the first to shed light on the role of data access in shaping these dimensions. And finally, there's a broader literature on the science of science that has studied other fields, such as biomedical science. And that work tends to underemphasize the role of research inputs, such as data in shaping the field. And so our work also sheds light on that area. So with that introduction, let me jump into precisely how we get to these findings. So what are admin data? Admin data are broadly defined as not just government data, but any kind of data not originally collected for research purposes. What's really exciting about admin data is they can be really quite comprehensive and universal. And so they leave a lot of degrees of freedom for researchers to answer the particular questions that they want to answer. So this comes from Janet Curry and co-authors. So if you look at fraction of papers in top economic journals and NBR working papers, almost 20% of papers in the top 5 journals in econ are now using some form of admin data. And about 30% of NBR working papers use some form of admin data. And a lot of this comes from US government records. In the US, the history of these data are actually quite old. They started with the Center for Economic Studies that in the 1980s started to harmonize some of these admin data. And the first studies that came out of this were by Census researchers because they were the only ones who had access to this. So these are a few early famous papers, including this paper by Ollie and Pekis and Davis and Haltewanger that look at census manufacturing surveys. So these are not even things like the LEHD or the LBD that are more popular, but just using the census of manufacturers, we learned a lot about the US economy. And the key thing that we learned was there's a ton of heterogeneity. And so economists really started to take that seriously. A good example of that is when economists studied import, export, and trade. Again, they found a ton of heterogeneity. Here are a couple of papers, and that also inspired a ton of other theoretical work, including the famous Melitz model, which explicitly quotes that the use of census data to discover heterogeneity was a key inspiration to create this trade model that then has over 30,000 citations at this point, right? And so we can already see the effect of access to data is actually quite complex. It highlights new facts. It has spillovers on theory, on empirics, and can lead to important new insights without directly using that data itself. And so our work really provides a research design to encapsulate all of those different spillovers. The way we do that is by using Census RDC centers. These centers, now there's about 30 of them that exist that are there all over the country. And the reason that these centers are interesting from an identification point of view is typically studying access to data is quite challenging because someone posts it online and everyone has access to it at the same point in time. Unlike that example, here you need physical access. So projects have to be reviewed in advance. It's quite onerous to work with these data. You need a background check, special sworn status. This might take about 6 months to a year. And even once you go through all of these hoops, you have to be physically present in these RDCs to run your regressions or do the analysis. And even once you've done your analysis, someone at Census has to approve these to actually take them out of that building, right? So these are actually quite painful to work with. And there's a lot of discussion about, is this the best way to set up access? So when I talk about access, this isn't the kind of access that you or I might be used to with some of the other data that we worked with before. So it's kind of hard to get a picture of an RDC. This is about as far as you can get without sworn status, which is where I'm at this moment. When we think about like where these centers open, a lot of RDCs are funded by the NSF, and there's explicit goals towards equality, and I'll talk about that, and that's going to be really important for our identification. So when we interviewed a former RDC administrator, many people are interested in opening an RDC, but NSF is trying to implicitly balance geographically across different parts of the US. And so we think this offers a credible source of variation in order to understand the effects of data access on follow-on research. So here's an example of early RDCs. Note that Berkeley was probably the third RDC in the US, but there wasn't one at Stanford, even though there was interest, because there was already one at Berkeley, right? And so I'll show you that Stanford researchers weren't very thrilled about that. Over time, this really expands. And at this moment, there's about 30 different RDCs. And again, you can see kind of this geographic balance between the different census zones over time that we can exploit to understand how RDC establishments affects follow-on research. There's a heroic data effort that goes in because there isn't a standard database of economics research that I won't spend a ton of time on, except to say that our final set has about, whoops, can you help me? I think I might have pressed something here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Our final data set has about 15,000 US economists who have been AEA members, and we track them over about a 20-year period. And in particular, we track a bunch of different outcomes, such as top publications and citation-weighted yearly pubs. A lot of this comes from like a giant set of about 900,000 scientific articles that Economic publishes. We also had to go through a painstaking process to understand the data that are used inside papers. And there's a bunch of different sources, including FOIA requests to US government agencies to figure out which particular papers use some kind of census data versus not, as well as other machine learning techniques. The final thing we do is we want to classify researchers as empiricists or theorists. And so we build on this model by Angrist et al. To classify this paper is 83% theory according to our model, while this one is 96%. And so we broadly use means at the researcher level to classify them as empiricists or theorists. And using that, we can then start to get at these heterogeneities that I talked about before. I won't spend a ton of time on the descriptors, although I'm happy to talk about them later. The key thing we're going to be tracking in the panel data is the likelihood of a top publication by an average researcher in an average year is quite low. Even in the top 30 publications, about 0.14 publications on average. And top 5 papers is about 0.04. So this is a very low probability event, and we're going to look at how this low probability event is affected by the opening of an RDC. Here are some, again, descriptives on the timing variation that we exploit, but it might be instructive to take a sample of our data. So Michigan gets an RDC relatively early in 2003, while Stanford, after much waiting for over 11 years after Berkeley opens its own RDC, gets one in 2010. If we look at our own data in terms of census papers that use census data, you can see that this has direct effects. So as soon as the RDC opens, there are a couple of papers before by collaborating with census researchers, but you see much more research later. In Stanford, you can see that the use of admin data and research is significantly delayed, right? Even though we think these both are R1 institutions. Here's Berkeley itself. There's a bunch of research lately, but what's interesting is citations kind of take off right after an RDC opens, right? So these data centers opening is also getting empirical researchers more aware of the kinds of facts that one can learn from these data. And I'll show you that this really matters. So I'm going to run through results really quickly in 3 different portions. The first, we'll look at how data access affects data use and data citation. So think about this as just diffusion. For everything I'll show you, it'll be a standard event study regression, where we'll control for researcher fixed effects, your fixed effects. And so the variation will be coming off of an RDC opening when a researcher is fixed, or a researcher moving to an RDC institution, although the results are robust, to completely throwing out that second source of variation. Yeah, so there's also the kind of more complicated temporal fixed effects, if you would like. Here are kind of the baseline effects. So on average, these citation rates are about 0.003. You'd see that they're about double after an RDC opens, just the likelihood of using census data. And citations increase by about 50% once an RDC opens. Here are kind of what those event studies look like. So local access seems to really matter to both the use of these data and for the awareness of this data. Second, we want to look at how they affect productivity. Am I producing better research or more research once an RDC comes up? And if so, is it going to be mostly focused among empiricists? On average, these are the 2 variables that we're going to track for now. And again, here we see effect sizes about 20% order of magnitude in terms of when an RDC opens, relative to the baseline of about 0.15. When we look at high impact work, this work tends to be significantly more high impact compared to work that doesn't use census data. And so these effects are slightly larger in percent terms. Although this is really hard to interpret because this is a publication time citation count variable. Again, the event studies look relatively clean, although you kind of see this publication lag here for about 2 or 3 years, which makes sense if you think that's how long these papers take to try and get published. The same results kind of hold true for top 5 publications, or like whether we look at these publications are in the extreme distribution of highly cited papers. I will skip all the robustness checks that are kind of in the paper, but perhaps the most interesting part is to look at the mechanisms through which data access is affecting productivity. Not everything I showed you was researchers publishing papers directly using census data. So what we do is we code economics papers into about 20 broad topics, everything from institutions, trade, energy, to labor, statistics, micro, and some of these are more theory topics. And then we look at whether researchers are using these new data to do what they did before better. So I studied education, I could never see test scores before, and so now I look at kind of the same topic with better data, or I'm actually changing my research focus. And what we find is more of the latter. So researchers are more likely to use new JEL codes or use these new topics as coded by LDAs compared to the baseline after a data set opens. So what we think is going on is that these RDCs are opening up the kind of low-hanging fruit in different topics than kind of what we're working on that leads me to kind of work on those topics myself. Another kind of test of this is we look at what we call FSRDC JELs. So these are the kinds of topics that are better studied with census data. So it's really hard to do development in Africa if the data are mostly US focused versus it's relatively more straightforward to do a manufacturing survey in the US. And so we show that kind of these effects are much larger when we look at just FSRDC JELs as compared to non-FSRDC JELs. So the new topics are really not just random set of topics, but the kinds of topics that could be better studied with these data. Another interesting fact is these data have spillovers or knock-on effects on research methodology. So when we look at the likelihood that more survey-based research is done, we find very little to no effects. Obviously, the use of admin data goes up in general, but also the use of quasi-experimental and methods goes up, but not experimental methods. So again, the kinds of research that could be done with RDC data are affected in terms of methodology, but not some of the other high-quality methods that we might see. And finally, this I think is perhaps one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for this mechanism. These spillovers are restricted to only those who cite research based on admin data. So if we split empirical researchers into those who will never engage with admin data, we find that the effects for them are quite small to zero. Most of these spillovers are concentrated among those who build on this kind of research. So like the Melitz model that we saw before might not directly use admin data, but cites a lot of work building on top of the data, and that's where these effects are concentrated. Similarly, we look at departments with high adoption versus non-high adoption, and this is actually quite this is not very precisely estimated, but again, we see the effects are kind of focused where there is indeed this first stage adoption. So use seems really important in order to diffuse the general value of this data. So let me conclude, and then I'd love to get your reaction and your comments. So hopefully what we are trying to put forward in this paper is if you want to improve policymaking, and if you want to improve the kind of evidence that we have to promote policymaking, investing in data infrastructure and investing in access to data is a very critical first step to enabling that kind of research, right? So how does access to data shape the quantity, quality, and direction of research? And so we're able to shed light on that in a quasi-experimental way using this kind of unique data set. And there's really kind of three main findings, which is that local access matters for the diffusion of these data for people to understand how to use them and what insights come from them. Second, they matter for productivity, especially for empirical researchers. And third, they shape researchers by pointing them towards different things than kind of what they were doing before. A lot of the policy focus in DC has been around topics of privacy and the challenges that you have from exposing these data more publicly. But we haven't had a lot of discussion on the potential benefits in terms of research. So any policymaker that is trying to balance that privacy versus benefit trade-off, our research hopefully provides them with some estimates to kind of to make that trade-off kind of more in a more data-driven way. So kind of just going back to the image that I started with, maps really that's what these data are. They're descriptive maps of what people in the US are doing or what firms are doing. In the same way that the Webb telescope is providing, has a really powerful effect on stimulating follow-on science. And so if you care about good science and we care about good science informing policy, we should also care about how we design the details of the data infrastructure. So hopefully that's some food for thought, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions. Yes, Hillary.
Thank you so much. That was super fun. I'm actually a member of the Committee on National Statistics at the National Academy of Sciences, and we spend a lot of time talking about ways to improve access to administrative data. This never occurred to me, and I can't wait to take it back to NSF as the funder, and so it's super exciting.
Thank you.
A couple of questions. One is, do you think, so I like how at the end you brought it back to, we've got more productivity, higher publications, and what? Like, does it cycle back? Can you, can one take it back to its influence?
Yeah.
And I was sitting here thinking how you might do that, and I'm not sure that I know.
Yeah.
But one kind of easy thing to explore might be reporting of these studies in high profile venues and whether they get out there more.
Yeah.
And maybe that's one ingredient in the path towards influence outside of academia. One very in the weeds question, given that economists are such a highly mobile profession, what do you do about folks that move around? I thought a lot about grad students because it's like accessing administrative data is particularly valuable for people without an existing network of co-authors around the country. That was one thought I had that might be interesting to look at. And then the third thing is something interesting for you to contemplate is now the FSRDC version 2.0 is getting more access virtually. And that's really accelerated during COVID and after. So thanks very much.
Thank you. I'll take, delighted to chat more also about how this could inform the kinds of conversations you're in. So that's great. Just on the second piece, we do worry a lot about these, what we call movers. So both people who move out of RDC centers and people who move in. A lot of RDCs are based at kind of higher ranked institutions. So you could imagine someone who's already doing well in their career gets hired at one of these places. And so what we're picking up is kind of that trajectory. So all of our estimates go through just dropping movers completely. So anyone who's kind of staying at an institution and an RDC opens, they kind of open up. And we've done kind of other analysis to kind of get at the heart of that. I think there's also something interesting about exploiting that variation more, which I think is a really good idea. So we should do more. On your first point, I agree. Like, I think we need to do more. We have citations, but those are again within academia. There's a new measure of citations in policy documents that is coming up where people have done scanned government documents and coded government policy documents to academic citations. And so we could potentially try to bring in some of that research. I just read the act that the Biden government recently passed on minimizing junk fees, and that quotes like over 15 or 20 different academic papers. And so like, I think we should do more in this field in general to try to quantify and understand that link. And I think bringing that data into the study would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Christophe Perignon from HEC Paris. In my home country, France, we have remote access to admin data. We can use from our own office data from 700 restricted sources of data. So what is the cost of having these physical centers in terms of innovation? Because you show very convincingly that there is a strong impact on innovation. So what would be the impact moving like to a full remote access system? Yeah,
I think that's really the question that Hillary also raised. Is and one of the other motivations is one of these policy documents by Card, Cherry, and co-authors talks about how a lot of the locus of this research is now shifting towards Scandinavia and Europe, even amongst European researchers, precisely because the terms are more favorable to get access to these data. And so my sense is that elasticity is actually quite high. In another paper, we're quantifying kind of the dark side of this. And so we show that a lot of this adoption is by more senior researchers and those in well-resourced institutions. And so we think the more we can reduce some of the costs of this is going to democratize this a little bit more. No data to speak on it so far, is too new to say something, but my hunch is that that really matters quite a bit. So these should be seen as kind of underestimates, just given how hard it is to access this data. Thank you so much.